My early life really was about gaming, and in particular, some of the very early Mario games. And I had a lot of fondness for playing some of the early Marios, particularly Mario Brothers 1, 2, and 3. I'm a big fan of Mario Brothers 3. I loved it, especially the raccoon suit. But I always used to find this really interesting when you got to the end of a level and it said, thanks, but Princess is in another castle. And so this was always a tagline of your life. You got to the end of the level and you were like, oh, okay, so Princess is somewhere else. But what I always remember about the Mario games is that it was very, very, what I will talk about, heteronormative. Everyone was presumed to be heterosexual and so on. And it was about that, the classic capture the princess, rescue the princess storyline. Princess in those days was very, very passive as a character, had very little voice. And actually, I don't think has fundamentally changed too much in later games. But Nintendo have started to wake up a little bit to the fact that actually this woman has her own personality and so on. But this was my early life. This is what I was used to seeing. And remember this, please, because I'm going to come back to this at the end of it. So that then kind of shifts on. And I remember growing up and getting my first Nintendo Entertainment System, and then the Super Nintendo, and then the Nintendo 64. The days. But I remember coming across Metroid at the time, and I really loved this game. And myself and my friend Chris would play on a Sunday afternoon. And we found it a difficult, infuriating, but really cool game. We liked the fact that, Samus could roll around and do all kind of great stuff. But at the time, the packaging presented the storyline to be something like, as a last resort, the Federation police have decided on a strategy to send a space hunter to penetrate and destroy the mother brain. Now, this person was only simply known as Samus, and it was called at the time He, which was fascinating. It's the greatest of all space hunters. And so this person, in a heavily armored bodysuit, you would take around the levels. You'll probably all know this. And it was a really, really interesting kind of, at the time for me, storyline. What was fascinating was that the end sequence, Samus was revealed to be a woman. And I've looked back on articles about this, but I actually remember collecting the magazines at the time. A lot of articles have kind of, these things have been lost within the passage of time and so on. But I remember a huge fan letter furore about this. Some people saying they couldn't believe it was a woman. It almost and effectively disrupted their ideas of what gaming should be. And in many ways, queer game characters do this. They disrupt the space, or they queer the space in many ways. And in the sense of Samus, that just started the process of flipping the spotlight over a little bit. And whilst this wasn't the first time we'd seen some things like this, a lot of independent games had done things like this before, but it very much had echoes of the film Alien, with the female protagonist at the end, who was never supposed to be the person who survived, the person who was revealed at the end of the film. So this classic flip siding of stuff was really interesting, but it caused a huge fan outburst. I almost wish I'd had some of the early comics now and magazines that I collected at the time, damn it. But it was the beginning of a change, and a really interesting change. Samus has since changed as the years have gone on and has become a lot more interestingly kind of hyper feminine and a little bit more of a sex style object, as it were. It's a really interesting one, this one with Samus as an evolution. But it did set a certain standard at the time, and it opened up new discussions of female leads within video games. But before we get to this, and that was the kind of things that started to open my eyes, because bear in mind, I was, cranky, 6 years old at the time. I started to then think about, okay, well, why does it seem that none of the other games I'm playing reflect anything about my life? I'm a very out proud queer man. So there was very little there. And still today, I think a lot of the gaming world is still playing a lot of catch up with this. And we see the effects of some of these theories from queer theory, which I'm about to talk about, which we could maybe start to look at and explore in light of that. And the first one, for those who don't know about it, is called heteronormativity. It's this idea that in our society is fundamentally structured around heterosexuality as being the most normal, natural expression of sexuality, that it's the gold standard, as it were. When in reality, we know historically that we have, and still do, we have a multitude of sexualities, and yet one is prized above another and is seen as a gold standard in terms of where you're supposed to be in life, what that's supposed to look like. And we've set certain milestones in our life that we expect all people to achieve. For example, wedding, children, all of those kind of classic milestones. And this is another term to throw on the mix, what we call chrononormativity, where we believe that people follow a life course which is predominantly heterosexual, where people settle and come to stages in their life which reflect that. And a lot of them are based around this. For example, try buying a wedding anniversary card for a same-sex partner in a card shop. It's an experiment for you all. It's a difficult task in itself. Especially in some of the classic card shops. So a lot of society is structured and built up for that. That's why people come out, isn't it? They come out because you are going against that standard that society has set for you. And within this, we have a classic piece of work from Gail Rubin called The Charmed Circle. And The Charmed Circle is a really interesting piece because this affects everybody, not just queer people. And I will link this back to video games eventually. But if you look at the center of the charmed circle, these are the things that, when it comes to sex, that that society frames as being the charmed area, the golden area. So these are set aside binaries, which are seen as not part of the charmed circle. So, for example, if sex is heterosexual, married, in a monogamous relationship, it's about procreation. It's sex which is free and not paid for. It's coupled, i.e. with another opposite sex partner. It's within a relationship setting. It's of the same generation and not a generational divide. It's in the home, i.e. by that it means a private space. And it doesn't involve pornography, and it's using your bodies only, not manufactured objects. And it's vanilla sex, so not BDSM, for example. Now, we all drift in and out of this charm circle. This affects everybody. But if you look globally across the world, this charm circle is still very highly prized. And it reflects in a lot of what we do. The things on the outside of the charm circle, however, are the areas in which we can see where people drift outside of that. So if it's not heterosexual, it's non-heterosexual sex. Or it's seen as not married, it's in the sin, for example. And if we look across the Middle East or sub-Saharan Africa, or even parts of Eastern Europe, we still see these very normative ideas at play. Or that sex is about fundamentally procreation, and you're suddenly deemed as an object of pity if you don't have children, for example, in many cultures, including our own here in the UK to some extent, where people feel less of a man or less of a woman if they don't have children. So the charm circle still, whilst it may, come from 1984, still holds a lot of value in terms of our understanding about society and the way in which society prizes certain things over others. And you can see then, can't you, that there's a bit of a hierarchy at play here. So hope that makes sense to everybody. But embedded with this is that heteronormativity, isn't it? And that links and leaks into our games that we see, our gaming cultures that we face, our online worlds that we live in. And although there's been spaces where people have been able to disrupt that, it still plays a significant part of our lives. But a lot of people then say, okay, well, if there is kind of homophobia, transphobia within gaming and the external world generally, isn't that just about a fear? Isn't homophobia just about being, scared of? And my answer to that is that that's too simplistic. We've been used for too long to say it's just a fear of, and that's what homophobia means. It really isn't that. It's deeper than that. And there's a great author by Plummer called Gender Taboo Theory, who says when homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia strike, it's when people cross these invisible lines of how to be a certain gendered behavior and expression, or that might come across in your voice, your mannerisms, how you interact, what you talk about with people. And as soon as you cross those invisible lines of behavior, that's when homophobia and all of the other things that come with it start to strike, and you face those societal punishments. So it's more than a fear, isn't it, really? It's not just a person has a rabid fear of people who are queer. There's actually more work going on here. Because when you combine that charm circle, when you consider the role of gender in this, it actually all comes crashing together. These are the conditions in which most of our society is being built upon. And if you cross those invisible lines, there will be sanctions and punishments that come as a result of this. And that is changing, but it's only changing in certain contexts and certain circumstances. As soon as you start to have a discussion about transphobia, for example, then we're crossing a line there, and then all of a sudden there are attacks on all sides. And it's the same with homophobia. If you're too effeminate or whatever, you've crossed a gender taboo, and therefore you have revealed yourself, and that comes with its consequences. The final one from queer theory, and I'm very aware I'm going to run out of time here, is from R.W. Connell's Hegemonic Masculinity. And a lot of the systems that we have in our society are built up around masculinist systems. The gaming community, to me, always was, when I was growing up anyway. And it represented a space where you'd have that kind of laddish style banter. It was all about that growing up. And hegemonic masculinity was clearly at play. And this has been broadly split down into some key parts. The first part is apex masculinity. This is masculinity which is held by actually very few men. But this is something that's held up not just by other men, but by the structures around us as being the most honoured and desired form of masculinity. That will vary from culture to culture upon what that looks like. But in the West, we've particularly seen that as something like the alpha male style figure, as it were. But most people can't be this. This is actually quite rare and quite difficult to achieve. So a lot of people fit into what we would call a complicit masculinity. These are men in particular who don't have those apex qualities. They don't so they may use other forms of things instead to achieve this. For example, humor being the funny one, the trivia quiz expert in the lads group or whatever. These individuals, though, are complicit in the construction. They know that this system works the way it does. They know it grants them a certain privilege in the world that they live in, but they don't challenge the structure. Either they don't know how to or they don't want to. It brings them benefits and rewards. Benefits for being male throughout the system. And then below that, you have the more marginalized masculinities. This is in particular the way in which in the past we've marginalized social class and said that you're not part of it, or we've racialized some men and said, you know, you can never be as perfect as that white-bodied male man, as it were. This can also marginalize men with disabilities. Who may feel that they've been marginalized throughout masculinity or demasculinized, for example, if they can't have sex. And so these systems work in this way. And then at the bottom of the masculinity pyramid, as it were, is subordinate masculinities. And this is where largely and traditionally queer men have been placed. They belong to the subgroup. This is in opposition to the apex masculinity, where emotion, weakness, all of those factors, which can affect anyone regardless of sexuality, can be placed. But the fact that we've been presented in a certain way within games has largely been throughout the subordinate masculinity throughout time. And whilst I see changes happening in terms of this, and we can apply this model over to other factors, there are people holding some of this in place. It's not just the apex masculinity that keeps this going. There are other factors. There are also spectators and judges who affirm masculine hierarchies. Some of that can be women who themselves support the apex masculinity and the complicit one. So there's these systems, as R.W. Connell set into place to say, well, this is just one way of looking at it. And yeah, you're right. Butchers and masculinities expressed by non-men fitting into this, Sarah, is a really good question. They would always be viewed as a subordinate masculinity by an apex cisgender heterosexual man. Everything below that fits into a marginalized or subordinate. And this is the way in which our society has structured masculinity, sadly. But there's space here for resistance, real resistance on this one. I'd like to go further into your actual question, by the way, so I'm just running out of time. But the research in this one says, from what I could find, was, you're welcome. Greer explored thousands of gaming titles, and this is quite a classic study, so you may be aware of it, found 179 games with any queer representation at all. Trolled back. Through these games, only 83 of them had queer characters who were playable characters. Some of the early games were quite horrifying with the non-playable characters. I'll show some of them later. But only 8 of these 83 featured a main character who was explicitly pre-written by the developers as being queer, as opposed to them being queer as a character that you create. And I find that really interesting, because this is still very much the world that we're living in. There has been progress, there has been change, but we're still seeing parts of a charm circle at play. We're still seeing parts of heteronormativity at play. And when characters are represented largely across the board, we still see that hegemonic masculinity at play as well. And so what we've seen in the past in some games, particularly adventure RPG games, where queer characters have followed the bury your gays trope, which basically means, it borrowed from Hollywood, this one. It's when we tend not to do it as much now, thankfully, but a queer character always dies at the end of the film. You meet an unhappy ending, you die of AIDS or late stage HIV, or there's a tragic ending to the queer, basically, male or female, whomever. There will be a tragic end to them somehow. And that doesn't always mean death. It could mean rape. It could mean any other factor behind it. When men have been portrayed within games, other than the bury your gays trope, it's either been a sissy, effeminate, flamboyant, or a comical gender confusion where the voice has been elevated to a high pitch, or whatever. That tended to be what we saw throughout most of gaming histories. And as Slawinski said, gay gamers experience a double-edged sword of prejudice. And by gay gamers, we're referring really to awkward terminology, but we're talking about the whole gamut of the LGBTQI plus here. The mainstream gay culture and media actually has never traditionally been supportive of video games in any real depth. You can pretty much open a queer magazine and not see much reference to it outside of the main commercial ones, anyway, inside of the main commercial ones. Then you've got a video game culture that's also not supportive of queer culture as well. So you've got these people kind of stuck in this grey space, don't you? Who have this and face this double-edged prejudice, and who have tried to find places of their own. And when doing so, they've met with some really interesting results. And you may remember the World of Warcraft LGBTQI guilds, who were actively threatened by the administrators of World of Warcraft, and told to take their guild down. And so there are still those punishments for daring to go against heteronormativity, for daring to go against that idea that, you know, we're stepping outside the charm circle here. And so that can threaten other people quite powerfully, and that's where the homophobia, you've crossed those gender taboos, it starts to emerge. Now, I used to love Streets of Rage, and when doing a bit of research behind this one, I discovered this one, and I can't say I remember it from back in the day, because I was an avid Streets of Rage fan. But I came across Ash, who was an unlockable character, who, when you look at the portrayal of Ash, is absolutely horrific. So Streets of Rage had this unlockable player who was a boss, and who was, at the time, almost queering the space. Whether you see this as a positive affirmation or not is, I guess, entirely subjective. But this was one of the representations at the time. So this is what we're talking about when we're seeing queer characters who are brought in there. They're put under a specific trope or specific appearance. The next one was Final Fight when it came out in 1990. Capcom at the time introduced female characters as villains, but Nintendo in particular didn't want female villains as characters. They didn't support domestic abuse and so didn't want male characters hitting women. So the developers of Final Fight said, but these aren't women, they're transgender women. And so Final Fight was allowed to keep the characters of Foxy and Poison, where the men could hit them because they were transgender women, not cisgender women. I know, Tanya, I know. And then I remember playing The Sims, and this was seen as a huge, opening of queer characters at the time. In The Sims 1, you could have same-sex couples. Now, I tried for ages with Sims 1 and this one. I could never get my damn character to kiss another man. They were called roommates when that did happen, and they lived together. And I just found it a rare thing built into the system. I'm not sure if anyone else has any experience of bringing up a successful same-sex couple on this one, but I really struggled, and trust me, I tried. And then in The Sims 3, you could, which was maybe well-meaning by the developers, but it come across as quite grim. You could convert your community. And what they meant by this was that if you had if you could convert another sim to be queer, then more queers would appear in your neighborhood. So essentially it was like this weird conversion therapy thing going on. And The Sims at the time were held as a kind of revolution in bringing together these characters. But this is absolutely crazy. It wasn't until The Sims 4 that any real progression started to happen. But The Sims 3, that whole idea of converting a community was just, you can see how that would go down globally, can't you? You know, it feeds a narrative of what we get coming back at us about you're just out to convert people from straight to being queer. But this is what The Sims did. Then we've got the ridicule of Birdo. As a Nintendo fan myself, I always had a bit of a soft spot for Birdo, actually. Birdo has gone through an odd time with Nintendo. Nintendo don't seem to know what to do with Birdo. Birdo was told by one of the developers that Birdo is a man that thinks he is a woman and would like to be called a birdette. Since then, there's been a huge discussion about Birdo being transgender. There was an awful game which was only released for the Wii in Japan, where Birdo entered a toilet and a public restroom and was arrested and could only be freed upon production of her femininity, which was to produce a dildo in the game, which is really weird. And so was then allowed to, that affirmed her femininity and was allowed to be seen as a woman again. And this, so the ridicule of Birdo amongst fans actually sparked big online debates at the time of who Birdo was supposed to be, and Nintendo still seemed to very awkwardly not know what to do with Birdo as a result. Then we had the Tomodachi Life. Sorry, Steph, I've gone a little over. I promise I haven't got long left. But if you wanted to play Tomodachi Life and for your Wii at the time, then people are really excited about this. It was like, oh, you can build up your own community, your friends and your drama and all the rest of it. However, it was only if you were straight. In fact, Nintendo at the time said the relationship options, this was after fans kicked off, the relationship options in the game represent a playful alternative world rather than a real-life simulation. We hope that all of our fans will see that Tomodachi Life was intended to be a whimsical and quirky game, and that we were absolutely not trying to provide social commentary. Now, I'm not sure about you, but I don't see my same-sex partner as a social commentary. I found that very interesting, the way they phrased that. It was too late to offer a patch. And so they could never do anything with the game afterwards. But it was just another classic case of how at that charm circle, very heteronormative idea was pushed forward toward all of us. And there was no negotiation there. And then when fans did complain, this Nintendo responded with, well, we're not here to provide politics and social commentary. Which I find odd. So now, what about now then? Where's the resistance? There's a ton of games on the list, both to varying effects of effectiveness, where characters or key players or whatever has been significantly queer, some better than others. Finally, you can get married and have children on The Sims 4, which is nice. Dream daddy, I know, right? And so you can do those things. There's still been some complaints about some characters in The Sims 4 that The Sims still haven't got it quite right, but it's progress. I love this quote that when looking at game genres, it can be concluded that LGBTQI representation happens mostly in RPGs, adventure, and action games, largely, particularly RPGs and adventure, in that order. The other three genres present in their analysis of a ton of computer games going on here, the fighting, simulation, and shooters, weren't as representative at all. Now, what's interesting about this is because the fighting, simulation, shooters follow that hegemonic masculinity model, don't they, largely? And so the last thing a lot of developers want in there is selling to the target audience they're after is to have a much more subversive or submissive form of masculinity there. So we still have a long way to come. Change is happening. Globalization has brought the queer identities to the forefront. There's been some amazing things happening around the world. So I'm positive about the future, but this conference is an ideal space to be discussing this. So I'm going to leave you with my final thing. Remember Mario and your princess is another castle? In a way, we have potential to be going from this. Your princess is another castle to Adam Ellis to this one. Thank you, Mario, but your princess is another castle. But Toad, you are my princess. So anyway, thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for listening. It's my little take on all of this. I wanted a bit of a light-hearted, fun way of exploring the queerness within games with a little bit of queer theory thrown in. And I'm going to hand back over to Greg. Thanks, Greg.